Hello, this is Mary Mack, Enterprise Technology Counsel for ZyLAB, and we're going to start our webcast on information governance, 10 things you can do to get started. This webcast is co-sponsored by the Information Governance Initiative, where ZyLAB is very proud to be a charter supporter, and the Organization of Legal Professionals, where I am on the Board of Governors. Our speaker today is going to be Barclay Blair, and Barclay has been working in this field, I won't say for how many years, Barclay, and not only speaks about information governance, but actually helps clients implement information governance within their organizations. He's the president and founder of Illumina, and he's the executive director and founder of the Information Governance Initiative. And Barclay, I'm going to hand the slides over to you, and we're going to talk a little bit about, when we talk about getting started, I think Barclay, one of the things people have a little bit of a problem about is the vocabulary and the understandings around information governance. Sometimes it's like all things to all people, and then some people are the very pinpoint as exactly what it is. What do you see around the definitions around information governance?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's and we certainly get asked all the time at the IGI, well, what exactly is information governance? And in fact, I've had this conversation so many times that if I never had it again, I'd be very, very happy. But that's not going to happen, is it?
Because we put it as the first question because we knew you'd want to talk about it.
That's right. So, you know, first I'll give you the definition that I use and that we use, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the dimensions of that. We proposed this definition to our community, and 93% of them said that they agreed with it and they liked it. I think, you know, in my view, at the highest level, at the conceptual level, information governance is about managing information better. And sometimes we do that because we're driven by externalities like laws and regulations that, or agreements with partners and customers to manage information in a specific way, and then sometimes we do it just because we want to be a better business. So there's an overlap between the risk and the value side, but the focus is the same. And you know, I guess depending on your background, I think you'll focus on one of these aspects more than the other. For me, coming from my background, I think why I love the concept of information governance is its simplicity, and I love of the concept, and I love the idea that we're going to look at all information through the same lens, whether we're concerned about extracting value, whether we're concerned about confidentiality, whether we're concerned about privilege or e-discovery, knowledge management, records management. We are going to apply the same technique and the same lens to look at information. I think there's just huge value that can come from taking that approach. So, you know, we view information governance as having, playing a coordinating role amongst multiple facets or information disciplines inside of a company. Information governance doesn't become, you know, the czar or a department or group that owns all of these activities by any means, but what it does become is a coordinating group and helping to coordinate the information problems and solutions amongst, you know, the facets like this. The other side of this is, I think, when you ask the question, well, what is information governance, there are really three questions you're asking, and one is, what is it as a concept? And that's, you know, what we've been talking about so far. And then there's, what is information governance as a market? Is it something that I can buy? And, you know, what are the products and services in that market? And, you know, we're actually about to publish our annual report at the IGI in early August, and we asked the market questions about whether there was a market, and it was interesting. Most respondents said, I don't actually think there's a clearly defined market, but then they also told us that they're going to be spending more money on information governance next year than they are this year. So I think it's a typical of a space that's kind of emerging or in its infancy, that there's a lack of clarity about what products and services and things that you can buy are actually in this market and which things are not. But at the same time, organizations are spending money to try and solve the problems of information governance. And the final level of a definition, or again answering the question, what is information governance, is what is it as an operational model? In other words, what do I do? What is the work behind information governance? And I think that's again, in our survey and in our report, we asked folks a lot of questions about that, and I think that there's clearly, for most practitioners right now, I think most of them come from a records management or e-discovery background. I think that more folks from the IT side and kind of the data management side are coming into the space. But fundamentally, there seemed to be pretty broad agreement that information governance, if it is to provide value, the value comes from this coordinating function. So in a new way, really trying to ensure that if we're working on a project around privacy over here, if we're working on a data remediation project over here, if we're working on an analytics project over here, that there's coordination amongst those projects. Because in some cases those projects can't go ahead unless we can actually do that coordination. So that's a useful model, I find, to think about the question of what is information governance, and think about it as having kind of those three dimensions.
So Barclay, when once people get the information governance bug, many of the people on the line here listening will be part of the e-discovery community in their various roles. Are there going to be new roles in information governance, or when you're talking about getting an information governance project off the ground, what do you see in terms of the roles that are necessary for success?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess to kind of bridge off the discussion of the definition, the last thing I would say about the definition is that ultimately what's important is that you find a way to define information governance at your organization that makes sense and that your organization can buy into. That's more important than adhering to our definition or anyone else's. And I think it's the same thing when you start to talk about roles. If you think about information governance, we do advocate, and you'll be getting a sneak peek of this because we're going to really start talking about this in detail in August. We do talk about, or we do advocate for the creation of a new C-level role for information governance called the Chief Information Governance Officer, and we do think that that is a gap at most organizations, that ultimately whatever that role is called, the problem is that there is not typically somebody who is in charge of the information problem. So not everybody who's listening to our webinar, of course, is positioned to take that role on or even wants to take that role on, and that's fine. That's one of the roles that organizations need, but I think there's also a bunch of other roles, and people need to think through, given their skills and given their place in the organization, and given how they report into the organization, how can they best help the organization tackle information governance? And you see on the slide here, I said, certainly there's some of our clients, I would call them prophets, that they're the voice crying in the wilderness, saying a problem is coming, and unless we act today, bad things are going to happen. And that's sometimes the prophets do evolve into advisors and take on larger roles around information governance. But as we know, sometimes prophets get their heads cut off, and so it's a risky role. But you have to, it is a role that is essential. I mean, for organizations that don't see the light around what better management can offer them, it's a critical role, and I think lots particularly people who, like our audience, who have been through the fire on litigation and seen the horrors of poor information management and where that can lead in terms of the duplication and the extra cost and the strategic weaknesses in cases and all the other things. I think that there's a real authority that can come with that experience that is really useful in trying to move the organization forward. If your organization is farther along, I think there's clearly the role of advisor, taking that expertise and using it and applying it in the operational side. And then there's a role of the steward, which is really taking on and owning operational responsibility for part of the information in the organization. So I think those are some ideas in terms of roles. I do think that there's a real authority that comes from the legal profession and legal professionals around information governance, because often the problems of bad information governance, of course, come home to roost in the context of litigation and investigation. So I would really encourage people to use that as a base to establish authority around information governance in their companies.
And I would encourage people to look back to their experience in the early days of e-discovery in their particular organization, when none of the roles were defined and people basically stepped up and they took on new responsibilities even though it wasn't in their job title. If you were a paralegal or if you were an IT specialist, you were the email administrator or something of that nature, and the next thing you know, you're part of an e-discovery team. And how did that team arise in your organization? And were you part of the driving force, or did you have somebody who maybe was a mentor to you that perhaps you can follow a little bit of that cultural guidelines that they may have laid down for you? Or yourself in organizing something from scratch?
Yeah, I think it's great advice. I mean, it's, as you say, there's some significant parallels between those activities, and building off what worked in the past, I think is always a good idea.
Yeah, although organizations change, and clearly we need a wider skill set and perhaps more executive involvement in an information governance initiative inside a corporation. So what do you see as the important corporate roles?
Yeah. So right. I mean, so if we sort of step through our 10 steps, so we've talked about, well, defining what it is we're trying to achieve with information governance, define the role that you want to play or that you can play or the best fit for in your organization. And then the next logical step in that is, well, who else do I need to get involved in information governance? Now, one of the key things to keep in mind when comparing e-discovery to information governance is that culturally they are kind of different activities. One of the advantages, quote unquote, of e-discovery is that it's it's like the house is on fire and nobody sits around and has a budget discussion when the house is on fire. They just call the fire department, and the fire department comes and puts the fire out, and then you deal with the cost of that later. And information governance is a more proactive activity that isn't, the house is not on fire typically. It's a longer process. It's a more proactive and strategic process. So culturally, that means that an operational model around information governance is really important. A triage model or an ad hoc model doesn't work, because this is something that we're talking about taking on, building into the culture of the organization, and doing over a longer period of time. So investing in some of these foundational things and building those out over time is really important. So I wanted to just show you an example of a framework that we've used in the past with clients. This is kind of a genericized version of it, but just to show you some of the roles, but also to, I guess, just emphasize that this is the kind of thinking that you should be doing fairly early in the process. In other words, identifying the various actors in your information governance program. So whether those are committees or groups like you see in number 1 here, or whether they're individuals like you see with the CIO, you should just use a bullet point to write out what the responsibilities of that entity are in the information governance program. And then rather than try and come up with an exhaustive list of things that they do, just write down a few sample activities as you see here, or what's the core activity or the key one that they do. So you look at the CIO, for example. The CIO is responsible for supporting it in the IT environment, sample activities, assignment of resources, implementation, maintenance of software, hardware, and other tools necessary to support IG. So it doesn't have to be, to get started, a long, drawn-out exercise. Just think about who you want involved and what they should do. And I think in general, any IG framework is going to look somewhat similar to this, and that you're going to have some kind of steering committee, because it's a multidisciplinary pursuit. You really need that. You should have a person or a role with clearly defined accountability for it. You're going to need to involve IT. You're going to need to involve the general counsel. This model in number 5 has enterprise architecture, which is a role that only really exists in very large organizations. Internal audit, what do they do? Records management, what do they do? Training, of course, is if you have this group, it is critical for making sure employees understand what's expected of them around the management of information, department heads, all employees. So just to give you a sample of a model that we use, that we build out from with clients, as a starting point to say, let's really think about how we're going to implement, how we're going to make information governance happen here. There's 3 things that we need, right? We need the rules, and that's the policies and the procedures. We need the people. We need them to do something, and that's really what this framework is about. And then we need the technology to implement the rules and support the people. So I mean, this is just an example of kind of that second piece around who are the people and what should they do.
Yeah, interesting, Barclay. This really does highlight the difference between an ad hoc e-discovery exercise and then something that has deep roots, that is to be sustainable going forward. Yeah. So once you get all these people together, then what?
Right. I think it's right. So we've got our people together. We've got our roles defined. We kind of know where we're heading. We need to decide what we're going to do first. And I call this an operating philosophy, which is really just a fancy way of saying what are we going to do first, second, third, and fourth, and on down the line. Now, there's a lot of discussion in the marketplace right now about defensible deletion or disposal, or getting rid of legacy content as a place to start. And I think that there's merit to that, in the sense that often the existence of that content and the problems that it causes in e-discovery is kind of an initiating event. I guess to go back to Aristotle's elements of plot, that is the initiating event, that oh my gosh, and in our last case we found closets full of backup tapes, or an old email archive, and it's very expensive and time-consuming and problematic to get information out of these environments, so let's get rid of it. And the nice thing about projects, what I would call remediation, which is the 3rd level down in this diagram here, they do often have a good return on investment, in that you can recapture storage space, or you can get rid of storage capacity perhaps, or get rid of storage media or old systems and so on. But a word of caution is that, I just had this conversation last week with a client where they had a security breach. They, in their shared drive environment, so they went in, they locked down the shared drives and felt good about that, but in the course of doing that, they started to ask what I think is the right question, which is, well, should the information in these shared drives exist at all? And Of course, the answer to that question is probably not. There's probably, if they're like every other company in the world, probably about half of that stuff at least is outdated and duplicative and has no reason for being. So IT says, okay, well, great, let's just start deleting stuff. And so they kind of phone up legal for just a little check with them. Someone has the bright idea to do that. And legal says, well, whoa, 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 whoa. Hang on here. What is this stuff? Who created it? Is it any of it on legal hold? Is any of it subject to our retention schedule? And this whole thing blossoms into a big morass of problems where there's no clear way for anyone to answer the question, should this piece of content stay or should it go? Because they had not done the more foundational work. There was no clear and consistent policy in place. There was no clear and obvious decision process or matrix. Who had the authority to make these decisions? There was certainly no implementation of any of those rules or processes in that environment. It was a complete free-for-all, so when it came time to do remediation, it was impossible. So that's why, in a perfect world, what I advocate is that you would start, with some of these foundational elements, putting in place the rules. You would implement those rules in the culture with the people and in the tools, and then you have what you need to clean up the past. Because the other thing you have is you have a strategy for moving forward. If it's great and everything if you can go out and get rid of 50% of the content in your shared drive environment or in your SharePoint or whatever it is, but does that solve your problem going forward? It doesn't without rules, without processes, without tools that can help you manage the content going forward. In a year, you're just going to find yourself in the same place. So think about this as an operational philosophy or a model. In real life, typically when we do these projects, all of this is happening at the same time, just in different parts of the company or as it relates to different projects. But as a concept, I think it's a useful way to think about the problem.
So interesting, Barclay. So the organizations that have mature records management policies and practices are probably far along the line then in terms of doing some of this remediation. Is that what I'm hearing, or are you saying that there's more?
It depends on just how mature they are. I guess there's a difference between mature and should be put out to pasture, because part of the problem that we run into is we find retention schedules that were really designed sometime in the 1970s and haven't changed ever since. They have 1,000 categories. They assume that most information is in paper form. They assume that we can easily identify records. They assume that employees can spend their days looking for this stuff and taking it and putting it in a file folder and putting it in a box somewhere, and the policies are just not realistic or implementable. So conceptually, yes, absolutely, I would agree that those companies who do have solid records management programs are ahead of those that don't when it comes to information governance. But sometimes, and I think commonly, we see records management programs that have not really adapted to the current reality of the way information is created and how it's kept. So that is something to be cautious of. It's I see it with senior executives a lot. They say, well, look, we have a records management department, we have a retention schedule, so we're just checking the box on that we're good, when in fact those things are not actually being followed, and they can't be followed because they're out of date.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So along those lines, Barclay, you're now you have a framework to think about this, and you do want to get involved in some form of information governance activities. So is there do you have a process around prioritization? Is there like a brainstorm and then a prioritization, or how do you go about figuring out what's the first thing to tackle?
Yeah, I think that's really the million-dollar question. You know, all of this, everything we've been talking about up until now is fairly conceptual. Where the rubber meets the road and where dollars start to get spent is now we have to decide, you know, exactly what problems are we going to try and solve, and how are we going to go about solving those, and what is that going to take, and which ones should we solve first. And, you know, my adage developed over years of doing this is that, you know, look, a company cannot act on problems. It can only act on projects. Well, what is the difference between a problem and a project? Well, a problem, you know, is a statement of some kind of issue. A project is something that has dimensions of time and dependencies and ownership and responsibility and budget and resources and all the things that go into project planning. In other words, we've taken this problem and we've instead said, well, what is it going to take to solve this problem? And that's effectively what a project is. And so that's the difference between a problem and a project. And often when we start with clients, what they have is a big ugly bag of problems. And for, you know, months or years, at lunchroom conversations, at company offsites, at all the rest of that, what they do is they sit around and talk about these problems and bat them back and forth. And so the way to stop that, which ultimately is not helpful, is to take these problems, get them out on the table, and then go through a process to try and convert those problems into projects. So I thought, just to kind of underline this discussion, I would take you through a methodology that we use to do this with clients when we help clients do this. And this is a methodology that you can take and you can do on your own as well. It's not rocket science. It's just a helpful way to kind of think through and get from this place where you have problems to the place where you have projects. So, you know, this is a fairly standard kind of project outline, but the key here is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to gather information about our current environment, and both some quantitative information about what's happening in the environment, but also qualitative information. In other words, speaking to people in the organization and learning from them what's working in the organization and what is not. You know, talking to people who manage projects at your company, for example, and say, and you know, we go through an interview process where you kind of go through a list of questions like, you know, what are the primary tools that you use to do your job? What do you like about those? What don't you like about those? Where do you store information? How do you find information? You know, what is working for you? What takes the most amount of time? What is not working? And getting a profile of what a day in the life of different roles in your organization actually look like. So gathering up that information and then putting a focus on a really practical, typically one-day strategy workshop where you go through a process to take the information that you've gathered with the stakeholders in the organization around information and converting those problems into projects. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. And then ultimately delivering the results of that process in the form of a decision report or presentation where the goal is to go to senior management, and instead of bringing them problems, you're bringing them a solution. You're saying, look, we looked across our organization. We saw all these problems as it related to information, that nobody knows where anything is. We've got all this duplication. We've got this outdated stuff over in accounts payable. The process takes 4 days longer than it should because of these manual processes. You know, we've got multiple places where we're storing information. Nobody knows where to go. We need discovery. It's a nightmare, et cetera, et cetera. And we are presenting to you a plan for addressing these projects or addressing these problems through a set of projects, and we've taken a shot at defining what it's going to take to get them done, what it's going to cost, and the order that we should go about doing these. So a tool that is useful when you go through this process is to, so on the left-hand side, here you see a set of projects that we had developed for a client based on a list of about 150 different identifiable problems that they told us about. So we said, we think this set of projects are the projects that are going to take care of those problems, and I think that these are the priority of these projects and how you should go about doing them. So everything from getting the rules in order to making sure you have the capability to actually make change at the bottom, to actually implementing some new software and technological capabilities. So this was just a snapshot of here's where we think you are when it comes to the state of your information governance maturity, and then here's where we think you will be if you execute these projects as they've been laid out. And the key thing here is that you kind of have to set the dial for your organization. Where do you need to be on each of these dimensions? Not every company needs to be leading on every aspect of information governance. In this case, you have a company where not only is email absolutely critical to them as it is at most organizations, but it's also regulated in a really specific way. So they do have to be on the leading edge when it comes to the way that they manage email for those reasons and others. So, it's a process of identifying the problems, but then going through a process to try and convert those problems into projects, and then based on corporate priorities, based on resources and other things that are happening in the organization, proposing a plan for executing on those projects, in a specific order. I think that's the operational component of information governance.
Yeah, and then you have your projects, Berkeley, and then speaking the language of the corporation to launch something like this, getting the resources. How do you build the business case? How do you articulate the ROI, if you will, or the value to the organization? And then, can you talk a little bit about timing and the people that you would need to present this information to, these business cases to, so that they can resource you?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, as you can see, I mean, obviously, Mary, in our discussion here, we're just driving towards greater and greater specificity from, what is this, to, who should own it, and what's our philosophy of operations, and what are the projects we're going to do, and then what is all that going to cost, and what is the benefit, the financial benefit of that. And as you say, I think it's a good way to put it is that, taking on information governance is also about taking on responsibility for understanding and communicating its impact on the organization from a business perspective. And of course, the ultimate language of business is money, and being able to quantify the costs and benefits of information governance is important. So in our survey for our annual report that'll come out in August, we asked, interestingly, we actually asked practitioners, and separately we asked providers of software and services, is financial quantification important to the success of information governance? And they both, I think 80 or 90% on both sides said yes, and we asked them, well, how are you doing that? And they both said that return on investment as a financial model is the most common model they use, and the second most common one was total cost of ownership. So I'm not going to talk about those in detail. You've probably heard of them. You can Google them. There's lots of great information out there around return on investment and total cost of ownership, but they both attempt to accomplish something similar, which is to say, what are the costs and benefits financially of any given activity? And the trick in the world that we all live in as professionals who deal with information is that a lot of the costs and a lot of the benefits are so-called soft costs and benefits. In other words, employee productivity. So if I can make your life better by making it easier to find the information you need to do your job, that's not, no one's writing me a check for that. That's a productivity gain that is a soft gain. Similarly, if I can, eliminate duplication, if I can organize information better, I'm going to drive down some cost of storage or cost of information retrieval, and some of that is hard and some of that is soft. So the key is that you need a model that everyone in the organization agrees on. I've seen people spend a lot of time building out sophisticated financial models with all these soft costs, and at the end of the day, the executive says, well, I don't really believe that productivity gains are a thing that we can measure or that we should put a dollar value on, and all that work kind of goes down the drain. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples. This is one that I developed specifically around total cost of unstructured information. And in the middle you have, a set of activities that are common or sources of cost that are common when dealing with unstructured information. And on the right-hand side, examples of things that reduce cost. On the left-hand side, things that increase cost. And so this is a model that I've used with clients in various situations, and it's not, again, it's relatively simple, but it starts to put some dimension to the money side. This is a model, an example of a spreadsheet developed by a business partner of mine at Pretium Analytics, in actually putting together some sophisticated financial analysis of doing information governance. Again, just to show you an example. This is another one where, again, designed by Pretium, showing sources of cost. Here you have structured information, unstructured information. How much of that is there? What's the growth rate? Typical number of matters or e-discovery events and how big they are, and then you can see across the value and the financial benefits delivered by managing this information better, getting rid of stuff that has no value, getting rid of applications that have no value. And again, just to give you a flavor of kind of the language and the way that some of this presents in building out the business case. Everyone, again, in our survey told us it's important. Models like ROI are certainly the most common. Everyone told us by a majority that they do include soft cost in these models. And I think, I like to say that these models at the end of the day are more political tools than they are financial ones, because you need to build a model and put metrics into it that decision makers in the organization believe in. So you got to understand that before you start.
Well, and also after the project is over, something that you can point to and say, "Hey, we did it," rather than setting yourself up with some numbers, to in 2 years look kind of funny. So,
right. Yeah, great point.
Yeah. So different things are important to to different executives, different people with political power inside the corporation. How do you go about picking the first thing to get started with when you're trying to get an initiative like this, that has staying power and is sustainable over the years? How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's always a challenge. It's as the slide, prior slide said, I think there's everybody claims that the projects you should start with are the ones that have clear return on investment, and I think that's logical advice. But organizations aren't really logical entities necessarily. So I think there's a more artful calculation that you need to do in many cases, which is figuring out if you want to build support for a permanent information governance function, as you should be working towards, and so something that becomes a permanent part of the way that your company, your firm does business, you need to show success along the way. And you can't expect a fully blown and mature program overnight. And so you need to pick projects along the way that will demonstrate to people the value of what it is you're proposing. And so that varies by firm. So some of the projects that we see people starting with, as you can see, there's quite a range. I mean, there's, for some organizations, it starts with, as I mentioned before, the idea of, well, if this information didn't exist in the first place, then we wouldn't have to worry about breaches. So let's clean that up. For some, there's pressure from the board or from the outside or for some reason to start with, putting someone senior in charge and using that as the way to get started. At other organizations, scanning paper documents, is a way that they get started. It's a way to say, look, we claim to be a modern organization, but we still have incredible amounts of paper in the business process, and we think that if we can eliminate that, we'll show not only that we can drive down costs, but we can make everyone's lives in the company better because it's easier to find information. So, this is some of the projects that we see people starting with, and there's no right answer here because it really does depend on what's going to be doable and what's going to demonstrate the value of IG the clearest. The one thing I would say, though, to borrow a phrase from the environmental or recycling movement, I think starting in the 70s or 80s, is this think global, act local. And what I mean by that as it relates to information governance is that although we want to think about and conceptualize the problem of information governance on an enterprise level, ultimately we need to ensure that we understand what the challenges are at the local level, at the departmental level, at the group level, the work group level, the business unit level, because these big pronouncements that we make from a policy perspective ultimately kind of come home to roost at that level. And unless we understand what the problems are and what value that we can provide at that level, we will fail. And I've seen this happen many times before, where organizations launch off in a big highfalutin project, and when it all sort of comes down to it, finally, the business leads say, no, we're not doing it because we can't. This does not reflect the reality of our organization, the way that we work. And that was part of a huge project that went on for 3 years to standardize on a particular information environment and all these rules and beautifully designed taxonomies, and it was unbelievable. And when it came down the time to push the button, the heads of the most powerful business units said, we're not doing it. And the project managers had failed to understand really what those business units cared about and to get them on board and to provide value to them. So you really need to think about that, when you're building out your projects and you're deciding when to get or how to get started, and the first projects you should do. You need to understand the impact of what you're going to propose at the local level as well as the global level.
No, that's really interesting. We see a lot of opportunistic projects, particularly around forced migrations. Like if if an archive provider decides to sunset support for a particular piece of technology and the organization's forced to move, the question is, do we have to move everything?
Right.
There's a cost to moving everything, and then there's an opportunity to reorganize how information moves into the archive. And so we see organizations grappling with very opportunistic problems, and sometimes it's appropriate to insert some information governance in there, and sometimes it's just an emergency, almost like an e-discovery emergency, that they have to get something very quickly.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of just to follow up on that, a lot of projects in information governance are opportunistic, and I think that's really good advice also for practitioners, is to look for those opportunities and end of life for archives and other systems is a great opportunity, and sometimes the only opportunity, frankly, to have an impact on that information, to clean it up as part of the migration process, because the data is in flight and there's budget for that, and doing it as part of a migration is or a decommissioning is a great opportunity that you should take advantage of.
Yeah, actually, the migration cost is one of the hidden costs of applying new technology, and so when you talk about ROI, there's a nice bucket of money right there.
Yep, absolutely.
So we've got all our plans, Barclay. We've talked about our philosophies
Right.
and all of that. Are we gonna really get to the getting of doing it?
Well, now we just hand it off to someone else, and they can go and do it for us, right?
Oh, yeah.
We don't actually have to do this stuff, do we?
Yeah. Well, I think the people on this call are like, oh my gosh, now I have to do it, because more or less they're going to be doing it.
Right.
So let's talk about how you can be successful in a project like this that has so many moving parts and doesn't have the circuit breaker mentality of litigation, where you can say, well, the agency of litigation said so, or the
right.
the general counsel said so.
Yeah. That's why we're doing it, and that's why you should pay attention to me. Is I have a big stick over your head. Yeah. So I guess the simple answer is that, and I think this is actually, for legal professionals, one thing they know how to do probably better than almost anyone else is how to run a project, how to manage a project. And I think that, that's the art of information governance. As you say, the house is not on fire. You don't have a big stick typically. In some of these projects you will, but as an overall matter, this is it's a series of campaigns, and each of those campaigns need to be managed well, and you need to learn to love and embrace and employ project management techniques and change management techniques and all those good things that we know that we should do and are part of bigger projects. It's critical, and it's not a very well developed skill in some corners of information governance. Surprisingly, I think in the legal professional world it is, given the complexity of the projects that many have been dealing with, and so I think that bodes well for success in information governance. It's these projects can be very complex and involve a lot of moving parts. So from the execution perspective, you really need to manage this with a lot of discipline and a lot of rigor, because the other thing to keep in mind is that you've typically got a lot of different stakeholders and with different agendas, and that's a recipe for failure unless you can keep them all moving in the same direction. So from an execution perspective, project management as a discipline is just absolutely critical.
And I think in the e-discovery and the legal area, there's an intuitive sense of what information is sensitive in the organization, and what particular departments are a little bit more reticent about sharing information or have some hidden landmines or things of that nature. So it makes it makes it a great place to show to really show what you've learned over the years doing all the fire drills with litigation or regulatory response. So assuming, of course, we get a project off the ground and we monitor it and we can document our completion. So how best to market success, Barclay?
Yeah, so it's we've touched on this a little bit in talking about the financial models, ROI and total cost of ownership. And I think that those are incredibly important, and that's why we talked about them. I do, however, think that those models are not always possible. They're fairly complex. But one thing that we can all do, and I think that we should do, and I've learned this over a period of years, is that you really need to learn to tell the story of the success and tell it from a human perspective. Well, what do I mean by that? So I talked earlier in our conversation about focusing on people in the organization and talking to them about what's working for them and what is not, and what they like and what they don't like. When we do this work, we take that interview information, we take that person's picture, we put together a 1 or 2 pager, and we say, hey, this is Mary's work day. Here's what she does. Here's what works and what doesn't. And then when we're done this project, this information governance thing, here's what her world will look like, and here's the ways that it will be better. And telling it anecdotally, telling it in story form, telling it with the human face, I found that to be more powerful than almost anything else, because it's, as human beings, we respond to that. It also takes it out of the abstract and into the concrete and into the human, the flesh and blood arena, and everyone can understand that. Everyone can put themselves in those shoes. And if you tell those stories across a variety of roles, we typically take, here's someone, a senior manager, here's a project manager, here is a clerk or an information processor, whatever it is, and tell those stories. That's by far the most powerful thing, I think, in terms of marketing success, because you're giving it that human dimension. So I definitely recommend doing that. I think it's the most powerful way to tell your story. An example of what I touched on earlier about thinking globally and acting locally, you can see on the screen. It's great to say, for example, that information governance helps us manage our information better. But look, nobody's getting out of bed for that in the morning. But saying, this is an example from a global construction company we did work for. It helped our project managers close projects faster, so we get money in the bank 12 to 18 months earlier. Well, that's a story that people do get out of bed for, and that does have an impact and move decisions, because it's real money, it's a real benefit, it's concrete, it's specific. It talks about a specific role in the company and what the benefit is and how it benefits the company overall. So that's a great story. That's a great way to market success. This one, IG helps us comply with laws and regulations, yippity doo-dah, who cares about that? Well, what about IG helps our clinical trials managers reduce errors, produce better data, reducing time to market for new drugs? That is exciting. That goes directly to the kind of metrics that senior managers at a pharmaceutical care about. It's measurable. It talks about a specific role, and it talks about a specific benefit. So I think that's a great example of the kinds of stories that you need to learn to tell. You can tell them anecdotally, put a human face to the benefit and the success around information governance. Is absolutely the most successful thing that we do in this area.
Yeah, I think that those are excellent examples of not necessarily quantifying, but pointing to the revenue impact of being able to get to market quicker. That's the business people will be looking at that, and then also the free cash flow.
Right.
Of being, what's the benefit to an organization of being paid sooner?
Right.
Rather than needing to finance their accounts receivable or borrow from a bank or whatever it is that they would need to do if they weren't paid timely. So after all of this, Barclay, I see that you are now having a heretical suggestion that we take the rest of the day off, put our feet on the desk, and have the mint julep.
Well, on the seventh day you rest, of course. So after all of this creation work that we're talking about, yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's we've laid out a lot here, and right from the very conceptual beginnings of information governance all the way to telling the story of your success, and it's a lot to digest. And I think it's important along that process to be realistic, and it's easy to get frustrated, especially once you've kind of drank the Kool-Aid, as they say, and you see benefits of information governance for yourself, and you see that what it can do. And not everyone comes along at the same speed, so some patience is merited for sure, and taking a longer view. There are quick hits and successes that you can have along the way, but at the end of the day, you are talking about challenging the way that your organization manages information at a pretty fundamental level. So I see these programs pick up speed as more people get it and see the benefits and get on board, but I think patience is warranted. Success is possible, and I think using the strategies we've laid out here, I think success is even more likely. But it's important to be patient and realistic as well.
No, I think that's wise, especially speaking to the audience that we're speaking with, that are used to more adrenaline-based
right.
Projects. That this is a bit of a shift of a mindset, because it's more of a marathon than a sprint. Mm-hmm. Or, but not to lose necessarily that sprinting capability, because within a marathon, you can go on some shorter sprints, but it's important to recover as well. Information governance is about sustainability of an organization, and the people inside it, listeners included, also need to build in their own sustainability as they tackle this monster here.
Yep, that's right.
So, Barclay, I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts on getting started, and you've got some information coming out soon about the survey that you've done.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've got some information that might be helpful around migration costs. In particular, I've got a white paper that I did with Jan Schultes at ZyLAB on migration costs, which are to sort of expose those that might be helpful for folks. So to get more information about the Information Governance Initiative, people should go to your website. Go ahead.
Okay, it's actually been very interesting and quite fun. We've sat down with 30 information governance practitioners for an hour-long benchmarking conversation and just talking to them about what's really happening, what's working, what isn't, where are they at. We surveyed about 500 people. We did just a one-question survey with about 150 subject matter experts in information governance. So we're taking all of that and we're reporting out on that in the first week of August, which I'm really excited by. And there'll be really good data and metrics, I think, for everyone to take and use to kind of benchmark them to build support for moving forward with information governance at their organization. So that's our 2014 annual report, we're calling it, and look for that in the first week of August. And we'll also be launching a community for IG practitioners, and I invite all of our listeners to come and check that out. I think it'll be a great resource for, again, sharing best practices and networking with peers and just getting some practical tools to help you advance your IG program. The first thing we're going to develop with our community is a model IG steering committee charter. So, I talked about and I showed you an example of a framework. What are the roles and responsibilities and the reporting relationships? That's always a problem everyone needs to solve when they get started with IG. So we're going to use our community to support developing one of those, and we'll publish that freely, and people can take it and use it. So lots of good stuff going on, and yeah, please come check us out at iginitiative.com.
Well, we're really grateful for you helping us, certainly bringing us together, and then also giving us some tools so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel and we can jumpstart our projects. And Barclay, I want to thank you for spending the time with us today on this webcast. I want to thank the Organization of Legal Professionals for co-sponsoring, and of course ZyLAB sponsors as well, and we're information risk management and e-discovery. And if we want, you've given your website. If anybody would like more information, they can contact me.